Hello, and welcome to the Thematic Intelligence Podcast, a global data thematic intelligence. We track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all major sectors. I'm Martina Raveni, and today I'm joined by Oliver Gunasekara, CEO and co-founder of Impossible Metals, a company building underwater robotics vehicles for sustainable seabed mining. Hi, Oliver. Welcome to Thematic Intelligence. How are you?
I'm good. I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks so much for being here indeed. So let's start. I would like to start by asking you if you could tell us what deep sea mining is and what Impossible Metals does.
Yeah, deep sea mining at its highest level is extracting mineral resources from the ocean instead of land. So it's a form of mining, but instead of going to land, which is what we have done for millennium, we go to the deep oceans. And it's a bit controversial. There is no deep sea mining yet happening, but there's a lot of preparation work that is going on. And most of the technology that's being considered to do deep sea mining was actually invented in the 1960s and tested in the 1970s. And so we at Impossible Metals have decided to create some brand new 21st century technology that uses AI, robotics, computer vision, autonomy. And to do that, it allows us to extract the resources with much less environmental impact and much less cost and far more scalable. So that's a very high level. If you'd like, I could go a little deeper into deep sea minerals because there are actually four types that we know about.
Yeah, go on, sure.
Yeah, okay. So there are, as I mentioned, there are four types of deep sea minerals. Each type is found in different locations and needs different type of technology to actually extract them. So the type that Impossible Metals is focused on is probably the most popular type. It's called a polymetallic nodule. So it's a potato-sized rock. I actually happen to have one of them here. It looks about the size of a potato, but it's an ore body. So it's a rock that you find that just lies on the seabed floor. And it happens to contain huge amounts of nickel, cobalt, copper, manganese, and some rare earths. And that is the rock that we are attempting to harvest. Now, there are other resources in the ocean which are different. They're not these polymetallic nodules. So each has different locations, different technology that's required, and different impacts.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I think that's safe to say that land concentrations now of these minerals are decreasing. So, and that's the reason why we are looking at the ocean floors. And in general, this links to my next question. So, what benefits does deep sea mining offer compared to the land-based, let me say, the normal mining?
Yeah, I mean, because we've done mining for such a long time, what you find is that the biggest drivers of the economics, which is the grade of the resource and the location, tend to be very challenging. So let me give you an example. If we take nickel and cobalt, two very important metals for the energy transition, the first thing to say is that we need something like 500% more of these to get to net zero. So as we are moving away from fossil fuels, we're basically trying to electrify everything that we can. Electricity needs metal to move the electricity or to store it in batteries. So the demand is just rapidly growing as we decarbon and clean the energy supply to move to electricity. So that's the demand side. Now, if you look at what's there, well, 200 years ago, when we did mining for nickel and coal and copper, we could find ore grade at 20%. And by ore grade, I mean when you dig out the ore, what percent of it is the material you want and what is waste. So 200 years ago, you found some ore, you dug it up, 80% was waste, 20% was nickel or cobalt. if you look at a graph of that over the last 200 years, it's declined almost every single year because the high grade, good stuff we already mined, we exhausted it. So now we're forced to go and find deposits that are not 20%, but maybe 10%, maybe 5%, maybe 2%. And actually today, it's sub 1% for new deposits. In fact, there are many mines in Canada that are around 0.2% nickel. So you have to remove 99.8% of the material out of the mine. That's very, very expensive. And then separate it and discard it and store it. That really hurts the economics. So the grade is a big indicator. In the seabed, because we have the 4 metals in the one rock, specifically the nodule, the nickel equivalent grade is 16 times higher, like 3.2%, when you get a credit for the other metals. So that really makes a huge difference on the economics. The second thing to say is that on the cost curve, the other thing that drives the cost is the location. 200 years ago, we could go and find these metals very locally. We didn't need much infrastructure. But again, we've done all that mining. And so now when you look for new deposits, by definition, they're remote. They're a long way in the north of Canada. They're right in the middle of Australia or in a very remote location in Africa. And so this means that the grades are low, but also the infrastructure does not exist. So you have to build a train line, a highway, a power plant, a village for the people to work. All of that adds a lot of cost and time. Now, compare that to the seabed. We know from the surveying data that has been done over the last 50 years that the resource size is huge. We know for a fact that it is much, much larger, many times larger than all the reserves on land for nickel and cobalt and manganese. We also know that it's much higher grade, and we don't need to build new infrastructure because we just reuse ships and ports. So for all of those reasons, we can extract it. It's a huge resource. We have enough there to reach circularity where we don't need to actually mine anymore, maybe in 50 years' time. We can access it with the lowest cost. And with our technology, I think we can access it with by far the least environmental and social impact. Because if you look at that nickel, the vast majority of nickel today comes from a rainforest in Indonesia. And unfortunately, it's directly below the rainforest. So they remove the rainforest, all the biodiversity, all the biomass, all the carbon sink, gone, dig it up, and then they process it. And so the environmental impact of that is quite significant. And then in Africa, you often have children being used to do artisanal mining. Again, big social impacts. With our technology, we use AI. We look at the rocks, we hover. If we see life that we can detect, we leave it behind. We preserve the habitat. So it's a vastly different impact. So I spoke quite a while. I'll stop there. Hopefully that answers the question.
No, that's really interesting. I can really get the point that instead of a remote, harsh environment, lack of infrastructure, the cost goes down. I perfectly can get it. But one of the main questions that comes to me is about the challenges and the risks associated because it's in the deep ocean. Can you give us some data? How deep is it? How deep your technology can go? So because you're mining on the seafloor, so yeah, if you can clarify this.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we try to not use the term mining ourselves because we want to differentiate from what's done on land and what's done with the older technology, the dredging technology. So harvesting, and the ocean is a challenging environment. You have to deal with a lot of different sea states. It's often quite remote from land, and the average depth where these nodules form is about 4,000 meters. They can form as much as 5 to 6,000, but the average is about 4,000 meters. And so you have to build a vehicle that can survive those pressures, which are immense. You also, seawater is very corrosive. You have to build a lot of the sensitive components out of very strengthened materials. We tend to use steel, we use stainless steel, we use titanium, we use glass. These all have great characteristics that we like to use. But it's definitely a harsh environment, not too dissimilar to going to space. One of the other challenges is that in the water, radio waves basically don't work. So you have to find ways to communicate wirelessly that don't use radio waves. So we typically use acoustic modems or lasers to communicate. But these are very low bandwidth relatively to radio. And so, again, that presents challenges.
Last time when we spoke, you told me about the buoyancy issue that you had. It was really interesting. Can you just tell me a bit about it?
Yeah, one of the, I guess, unique requirements in our application is that the vehicle does not land. You know, the competing and older technology has big tracks that land, and those, a bit like a tank, you know, cause big sediment disturbance. And it also vacuums, it injects water into the seabed and sucks it up. And we really wanted to avoid that. And so our vehicle hovers about, 1.5 meters above the seabed floor. And one of the ways that we achieve that is by the use of a buoyancy engine, in fact, multiple buoyancy engines. So these are our own design. We have multiple patents pending on them. And, at a high level, it's a quite simple concept. We have a fixed volume glass sphere that we can pump water in and out of. And we have multiple of these. And so if we want to make the vehicle heavier, we want to dive, we pump water into the vehicle, into the spheres. If we want to surface, we pump water out and the vehicle becomes lighter, and now it will float to the surface. And as we pick up each nodule, we need to displace an equivalent amount of volume from the buoyancy tanks, so that the vehicle maintains neutral buoyancy and continues to
to compensate.
And so that's what we call dynamic buoyancy. It's a somewhat unique requirement, and it's something that we invented.
This in a way leads to my next question, and you already mentioned before about the if we stick to nodule harvesting, the conventional method, which is a dredging technology. We know that it's responsible for environmental destruction, and there are concerns about the environmental implication and impact of deep sea mining on the environment. Which are these impacts we're talking about, and how, if you can tell us again a bit better, how does impossible metals technology address them?
With our architecture, it's quite different. We don't need a dedicated ship. Our vehicles don't land, they hover. So we will have a small amount of sediment disturbance as we pick each rock one by one, but we've optimized the design of the arm and the claw and the movement to minimize that. And so it's a very tiny amount of sediment that's disturbed compared to a big plume that comes from a tractored vehicle that's actually injecting water. So we don't believe we will meet the criteria of a sediment plume. Secondly, biodiversity, and this is probably the one I care the most about. We know there isn't a huge amount of biomass. If you measure biomass by weight from some of the surveying data, something like 70% of it is bacteria. So bacteria weighs very little. So if 70%, if you have a kilogram of biomass and 70% of it is bacteria, there's very little non-bacteria, what we would call megafauna. But there is. There are corals, there are sponges, there's a species of octopus that can actually lay eggs on these. And this life is all very, very unique. So you go not many kilometers away, and you will find different species of bacteria, different forms of corals, different forms of megafauna. And so with our approach, the cameras are looking at the nodules and they're looking for these unique forms of life. Now, we can't see the bacteria because it's too small, but anything about a millimeter in size, we can detect. We have our own lights and stereo cameras. And if we see, say, a deep sea coral, which is maybe every 100 nodules, there is one. It varies, but that's an approximate number. Then we will leave it behind. We'll leave a quarantine area around it. And because it's selective harvesting, we're not removing all of the seabed. And we know that the majority of the bacteria and the biodiversity is actually in the seabed. We don't actually touch the seabed. We touch the nodules. So from a biodiversity, we've really gone out of our way to preserve that by using selective harvesting and only removing some of the material. And we're working with marine scientists to decide what's the pattern, because it's not only if we see life, we'll also leave corridors, we'll leave stuff behind. We won't generate big sediment plumes. Our noise footprint, we don't need the DP differential positioning on the ship. Our light pollution is low because we only use the lights when we're actually picking. We've really kind of gone out of our way to minimize the environmental impact. I want to be clear, there will be some impact. We're still removing, there's bacteria, there is always some impact, but we really believe this will have the lowest impact of any form of extraction and orders of magnitude less than what happens today in rainforests or in other areas in Africa.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for joining us. It's really been a pleasure. You can find our Robotics in Mining report on the Intelligence Center and in Report Store. Thanks all for listening, and from us in Thematic Intelligence, see you next time.